Decode the dark psychology of success. Nietzsche, Freud style and other thinkers. Why bad people win and your immoral advantage. Greetings, inquisitive souls, seekers of truth, explorers of the deepest recesses of the human being. Welcome to an extraordinary journey, an immersion into the turbulent waters of morality and success, to unravel a question that has resonated in human consciousness since the dawn of history. Why do certain figures, often labeled controversial, immoral, manage to reach peaks of power, influence, and recognition that seem unattainable for ordinary mortals? From ancient myths to contemporary narratives, passing through classical literature and modern cinema, humanity has manifested a persistent, almost obsessive fascination with those characters who dare to defy conventions, who deviate from the straight and narrow path of established morality and venture into the unexplored, often shadowy, territories of transgression. Think about it for a moment. In every era, in every culture, figures emerge who, although labeled as villains, rebels, antiheroes, or even misunderstood geniuses, leave an indelible mark on the fabric of history, in the collective memory of humanity. What mysterious alchemy operates behind their success? Is it simply a matter of lack of scruples, of unbridled ambition and a will to power at any price? Or is there a more complex, more subtle dynamic at play, an uncomfortable truth that we prefer to ignore? Today, in this space of deep and audacious reflection, we do not gather to glorify immorality, nor to extol the figure. Our purpose is much more ambitious, much more revealing. We are going to explore the ideas of some of the most insightful minds that the history of philosophy and psychology has given us, to try to understand why, in certain contexts, in certain circumstances, transgressing the rules, challenging the sacred, questioning the unquestionable, and embracing one's own darkness, that part of ourselves that we prefer to keep hidden, can be paradoxically a path, perhaps tortuous and risky, but a path nonetheless towards a form of success, authenticity, and personal and social transformation that mere conformity, simple obedience to norms, could never offer. We will delve into the depths of the thought of giants like Friedrich Nietzsche, the iconoclast who dynamited the foundations of Western morality; Fyodor Dostoevsky, the explorer of the human soul in its darkest labyrinths; Niccolo Machiavelli, the implacable strategist who stripped bare the rules of the game of power; Carl Jung, the psychologist who revealed to us the transformative power of the shadow; Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimist who taught us to embrace reality in its crudeness; Albert Camus, the existentialist rebel who invited us to find meaning in an absurd world; and Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, who unraveled the mysteries of the unconscious and repressed drives. Prepare for a challenging intellectual journey, to question your preconceived ideas about good and evil, success and failure, virtue and vice. Because at the end of this journey, I hope that you have not only understood why immoral success fascinates and disturbs in equal measure, but that you have also discovered powerful tools, revealing perspectives for your own personal growth. The search for a fuller, more authentic, and perhaps more successful life in a much deeper and more meaningful sense. So, with courage and open minds, join me in this descent into the shadows of success, where against all odds perhaps, we will find an unexpected light, an uncomfortable, but liberating truth. Friedrich Nietzsche. The will to power unleashed and transgression as creative imperative. We begin our exploration in the seismic territory, in the volcanic intellectual landscape of Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker who not only challenged traditional morality, but pulverized it with the force of a philosophical earthquake. Nietzsche was not a mere critic of Western morality. He was a radical iconoclast, a dynamiter of established values, a prophet of a new way of thinking and living. His philosophy, audacious, provocative, often misunderstood, remains as relevant and subversive today as it was in the late 19th century, when he scandalized Victorian Europe with his relentless criticism of the religion, morality, and culture of his time. For Nietzsche, life is not a pre-established path of virtue and obedience, a path traced by tradition and moral authority. No, for Nietzsche, life is a constant struggle, a passionate, sometimes tragic dance for self-affirmation, for the expansion of our being, for overcoming all those limits, all those chains imposed on us by the dominant culture, the herd morality, as he called it. At the heart of Nietzschean philosophy, the concept of the will to power beats with indomitable force. But let us pause here for a moment, because it is crucial to understand the true dimension of this central idea, often simplified and caricatured. The will to power, in Nietzsche's vision, is not in any way the mere desire to dominate others, to accumulate material wealth, to exercise despotic control over the external world. To reduce the will to power to this crude and superficial interpretation would be to completely betray the depth and subtlety of Nietzschean thought. For Nietzsche, the will to power is a vital, primordial force, intrinsic to every human being, to every living being, even to existence itself. It is the deep instinctive impulse to grow, to expand, to overcome one's own limits, to create, to leave a unique and unrepeatable mark on the universe. It is the energy that drives us to get up every morning, to face challenges, to seek personal improvement, to leave our imprint on the world. It is the force that beats in the heart of the artist who creates a masterpiece, of the scientist who discovers a new law of nature, of the leader who transforms a society, of the individual who dares to live authentically, defying expectations and imposed norms. Nietzsche needs us to break with the chains of slave morality, that morality which, according to him, historically imposed by Christianity and perpetuated by Western culture, invites us to submission, forced humility, the renunciation of our own greatness, the negation of the most powerful vital instincts, and to forge our own values, those that emanate from our deepest authenticity, from our unique vision of the world, from our own table of values, as he called it. Instead of blindly adhering to what society, tradition, or religion dictate as right or wrong, Nietzsche proposes a much more audacious, much more demanding path, daring to reinvent ourselves, to challenge imposed morality, to question dogmas, to explore the forbidden territories of thought and action, and to embrace what others, from the narrow-mindedness of conventional morality, call darkness, because, for Nietzsche, it is precisely in that darkness, in that liminal zone where transgression and creativity intersect, where the spark of a transformative force capable of revolutionizing not only our own lives, but also the world around us, resides. Imagine, for a moment, the archetype of the literary antihero, the cinematic character that fascinates us precisely because of their rebellion, because of their ability to question the status quo, for their courage to challenge established norms. Think about it carefully. Are these characters often morally ambiguous, complex, even dark, not precisely the ones that really move us, that make us deeply reflect on the human condition, that shake us from our moral complacency and invite us to see the world with new eyes, with a radically different perspective? The Nietzschean villain, the individual who transgresses conventional moral norms, is not in any way a mere transgressor for the simple pleasure of transgressing, for a gratuitous destructive impulse. No, the Nietzschean villain is, in essence, a creator of new paradigms, a pioneer of authenticity, an individual who dares to place himself beyond pre-established moral categories, who plunges into the creative solitude of his own vision, being misunderstood, judged, even condemned by the dominant morality, and who, precisely in that solitude, in that voluntary exile from herd morality, discovers the possibility of a personal rebirth, of a radical transformation of his own existence, and in many cases of a profound and irreversible transformation of the world around him. Nietzsche launches an audacious challenge to us, an invitation to creative rebellion. Dare to be yourself, he shouts to us, with the force of a prophet. Dare to be authentic, original, unique, even if that yourself radically challenges the expectations, norms, and values imposed by a society that fears individuality, that venerates mediocrity, and that punishes greatness. Because, according to Nietzsche, it is precisely in that audacity, in that creative immorality, in that indomitable will of self-affirmation, where the spark of a transformative force, capable of changing the course of history, of revolutionizing thought, of creating new forms of life, art, morality, beyond the narrow limits of tradition and conformity, resides. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Labyrinth of the Human Soul and Redemption in Moral Ambiguity. Continuing our journey through the shadows of success, we now descend from the dizzying heights of Nietzschean philosophy to the labyrinthine depths of the human soul, hand in hand with the Russian master Fyodor Dostoevsky, a writer who, like few others, knew how to explore the complexity, the contradictions, the paradoxes, and the abysses of our condition. If Nietzsche invited us to dynamite conventional morality from a radically philosophical perspective, Dostoevsky's us in the living flesh of human experience, in the whirlwind of passions, moral conflicts, and spiritual struggles that define our existence. Through immortal novels, masterpieces of universal literature such as Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, Demons, among others, Dostoevsky presents us with a universe populated by characters who are neither immaculate angels nor one-dimensional demons, but human beings of flesh and blood, trapped in a constant, agonizing internal struggle, where the line that separates good from evil becomes dangerously blurred, where virtue and vice intertwine inextricably, redemption and condemnation coexist in the same human heart. Let us take as a paradigmatic example the tormented Rodyan Raskolnikov, the unforgettable protagonist of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, a brilliant but impoverished and alienated young student, commits a brutal, premeditated, seemingly unjustifiable crime. He murders an old pawnbroker and her sister. From the perspective of conventional morality, Raskolnikov is, without a doubt, a villain, a despicable criminal who deserves the severest punishment. However, Dostoevsky, with his unparalleled literary genius, plunges us into the depths of Raskolnikov's mind, opens the doors of his tortured conscience to us, to show us that his abominable action does not arise from an intrinsic evil, from a sadistic impulse, or from a gratuitous desire to harm. No, Raskolnikov's crime is much more complex, much more disturbing. It arises from a personal, twisted, nihilistic, and desperate theory about the existence of superior men destined to transcend ordinary moral norms, from a morbid conviction that certain exceptional individuals, as he believed himself to be, are above good and evil, and have the right, even the duty, to transgress moral laws for the sake of a supposed greater good, a supposed transcendent mission. Raskolnikov is not a one-dimensional villain, a mere archetype of evil. He is a profoundly human character, intensely contradictory, consumed by a devastating internal conflict, a struggle of ideals, a battle between his moral conscience and his intellectual arrogance, between his desire for redemption and his nihilistic despair, which pushes him to transgress the limits of the socially acceptable, of the morally permissible, in a desperate attempt to affirm his existence in a world that he perceives as hostile, unjust, absurd, and indifferent to the fragility and suffering of the human being. Throughout the novel, Dostoevsky shows us Raskolnikov's psychological torment, his lacerating guilt, his existential suffering, his desperate search for redemption through confession and punishment. And in this painful process, In this descent into the hells of the human soul, Dostoevsky reveals to us an uncomfortable but essential truth, that the line between good and evil is not always neat and clear, that evil is not always what it seems to be, and that even in the most reprehensible acts, in the darkest characters, there may exist a spark of humanity, a deep yearning for transcendence, a desperate search for meaning in the midst of moral and existential chaos. For Dostoevsky, the human condition is inherently ambiguous, mysterious, paradoxical. Each person, the Russian writer tells us, carries within themselves a complex microcosm, an inner universe in constant turmoil, an inextricable mixture of lights and shadows, virtues and vices, noble impulses and dark desires, greatness and despair. It is precisely in this tension, in this internal struggle, in this coexistence of opposites, where the true identity of an individual is forged, where the unfathomable complexity of the human soul is revealed. Dostoevsky's villains, those morally gray, ambiguous, contradictory characters, resonate so deeply in us, the readers, because they mirror us, they reflect our own complexity, our own internal struggle, our own capacity to harbor contradiction and a paradox in our being. In them we recognize that part of ourselves that feels marginalized, misunderstood, judged, that yearns to be seen in its entirety, with its lights and shadows, by a society that often seems to simplify moral reality, that tends to pigeonhole people into binary categories of good and bad, and that seems incapable of understanding the infinite complexity of the human soul. Dostoevsky invites us, therefore, to transcend simplistic moral judgments, to abandon the comfort of binary categories, and to venture bravely into the dark recesses of the human soul, to understand that transgression, evil, can sometimes be a desperate cry to find meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to the fragility, complexity, and profound ambiguity of being. Niccolò Machiavelli, the naked realist power and morality as a strategic tool, leaving behind the exploration of moral ambiguity in the individual soul with Dostoevsky. We now ascend to the implacable and pragmatic arena of political power, guided deep by the firm hand and penetrating gaze of Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine thinker whose name resonates as an echo of political cunning, ruthless realism, and a demystifying vision of the exercise of power. In his immortal work, The Prince, a political treatise that continues to be studied and debated centuries after its publication, Machiavelli offers us an anatomy of power that breaks with idealistic conventions, that divests itself of moral garments and focuses, with brutal frankness, on practical effectiveness, on a ruler's ability to achieve and maintain control, to ensure the stability of his state, and to expand his influence, even if to achieve this, he must resort to methods that traditional morality, religious ethics, or idealistic philosophy would consider without hesitation as deeply questionable, reprehensible, and even condemnable. Machiavelli, a man of his time, a diplomat experienced in the intrigues of Italian Renaissance politics, observed with a clinical eye the behavior of rulers, the dynamics of power, the struggles for control and survival in an intrinsically competitive, volatile, and often cruel political world. And what Machiavelli saw, what he captured in The Prince, was a political reality far removed from Platonic ideals, Christian virtues, or abstract moral principles. His conclusion, audacious, provocative, scandalous for his time, and still disturbing today for many well-meaning consciences, was that success in the exercise of power does not depend in any way on naive adherence to a rigid moral code, on the constant practice of virtue, or on the disinterested pursuit of the common good. No, for Machiavelli, political success, effectiveness in the art of governing, depends fundamentally on an acute ability to analyze circumstances with realism, to adapt flexibly to unexpected changes, to anticipate the moves of the adversary, and to astutely seize all opportunities, whether morally clean or murky, ethically acceptable or reprehensible, that arise on the path towards achieving political objectives. The Machiavellian leader, the ideal prince according to the Florentine's vision, is not in any way the benevolent and idealistic ruler who acts moved by Christian charity, stoic virtue, or disinterested altruism. No, the Machiavellian prince is a cold, calculating, pragmatic strategist who focuses above all on the consolidation of his power, on the preservation of his state, and on the expansion of his influence, using for this purpose all the tools at his disposal, from political cunning, psychological manipulation, and deceptive diplomacy, to brute force, ruthless repression, and, in extreme cases, calculated cruelty. For Machiavelli, the ultimate end of the ruler, the raison d'être of his political action, is not the pursuit of moral perfection, nor the achievement of an abstract ethical ideal, but simply and plainly the maintenance of power and the stability of the state. And in this context, morality, ethics, virtue, cease to be ends in themselves to become mere instruments, strategic tools that the ruler can use or not, as it suits him, according to the circumstances, according to the political objectives he pursues at each moment. Thus, the Machiavellian villain, the leader who transgresses conventional moral norms for the sake of reason of state, is transformed, in the vision of the Florentine thinker, into a master strategist, an individual who operates in a terrain where the rules of good and evil become dangerously relative, where morality is subordinated to the implacable logic of power, and where the end, the survival and aggrandizement of power, often, though not always, justifies the means. Machiavelli does not affirm that immorality is desirable in itself, nor that cruelty is a positive value. He simply notes, with a disheartening realism, that in the terrain of politics, in the struggle for power, the rules of the game are different, the demands are implacable, and that those rulers who cling to conventional morality, who refuse to use the dirty tools of power, who are scandalized by the need to resort to force or deception, run the risk of being overtaken by their adversaries, of losing control, and of endangering the stability of the state they intend to govern. History, from Machiavelli's time to our day, is replete with examples of rulers who, despite being labeled ruthless, immoral, cynical, or even tyrannical, managed to transform entire societies, consolidate empires, promote profound reforms, leave an indelible mark on the course of humanity. Think of historical figures as diverse as the Roman Emperor Augustus, who consolidated the Roman Empire after decades of civil war, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, architect of the unification of Spain and the rise of the Spanish Empire, or the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who unified Germany and turned it into a dominant European power. These leaders, and many others, were not exactly models of moral virtue in the conventional sense of the term. However, their political astuteness, their ability to make difficult, even morally controversial decisions, and their strategic vision allowed them to achieve political objectives of great magnitude, leave a historical legacy that endures to this day. Even in our current context, in the contemporary world, we can observe how certain political and business leaders, through aggressive tactics, bold strategies, and sometimes morally ambiguous decisions, manage to stand out in an increasingly competitive, globalized, and ruthless environment, demonstrating, perhaps unintentionally, the validity of Machiavelli's thought and the persistent relevance of his realistic, albeit uncomfortable, vision of the nature of power and success in the nature of power and success. Political and social arena. Machiavelli, in short, invites us to contemplate power in its nakedness, without the idealistic garments that often adorn it, to demystify the moralizing narratives about leadership, and to recognize that, in the game of power, morality is often a luxury that few leaders can afford, or, in any case, just another strategic tool, subject to the calculations and interests of power. Carl Jung, The Archetypal Shadow and the Path of Individuation Through Darkness, leaving the pragmatic terrain of Machiavellian politics behind. We now delve into the deep, mysterious, and often unexplored territory of the human psyche, guided by the penetrating wisdom of Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the unconscious, of archetypes, and of the process of individuation. Jung, a dissenting disciple of Freud, went far beyond the exploration of repressed drives and childhood conflicts. To delve into the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, into the symbolic universe of archetypes, and into the search for psychic wholeness, for the integration of all dimensions of the human being, including, of course, the dark dimension, the shadow that we all harbor within us. And it is precisely through his revolutionary concept of the shadow that Jung offers us an essential perspective, a fundamental key to understand the human fascination with villains and the phenomenon of immoral success, to unravel why transgression, confrontation with darkness, can be, paradoxically, a path to authenticity, creativity, and a form of success much deeper and more meaningful than mere accumulation of power or social recognition. For Jung, the shadow is not simply the dark side of our personality, the repository of our defects, our vices, and our repressed impulses. No, the shadow is much more than that. It is an integral, essential part of our being, a primordial archetype that resides in the collective unconscious, a reservoir of immense psychic energy, a storehouse of unexplored potentialities, both negative and positive, both destructive and creative. The shadow contains all those aspects of ourselves that society, our family education, the dominant culture, and our own rational consciousness have taught us to repress, to deny, to hide, to project onto others. Our primary instincts, our negative emotions such as anger, fear, envy, resentment, our unconfessable desires, our inappropriate fantasies, all those impulses that we consider bad, ugly, shameful, unacceptable for our idealized image of ourselves, and for our adaptation to social norms. Now, what happens when an individual refuses to recognize their shadow, when they try to keep it repressed, hidden, denied, in the dark basements of the unconscious? According to Jung, the shadow does not disappear simply because we ignore it, deny it, or repress it. On the contrary, the more we try to hide it, the more power it acquires, the more influence it exerts on our lives, often unconsciously, subtly, and destructively. The repressed shadow is projected outwards, staining our perception of the world, distorting our relationships with others, manifesting through self-destructive behaviors, toxic relationships, rigid and inflexible moral judgments towards others, or even through identification with negative archetypes, with roles of victim, perpetrator, saboteur of our own success and well-being. However, Jung does not leave us trapped in the somber determinism of the repressed shadow. He offers us a path of hope, a process of profound transformation, the path of individuation which necessarily involves the conscious integration of the shadow. This arduous, challenging, often painful, but essential process to achieve psychic fullness consists in bravely confronting our inner darkness, in recognizing and accepting those aspects of ourselves that we would prefer to ignore, with our shadow, in understanding its motivations, its fears, its hidden desires, and in consciously integrating that repressed psychic energy into our conscious personality. It is not, in any way, about justifying reprehensible behaviors, about giving free rein to our destructive impulses, or about embracing immorality as an ideal of life. It is rather about understanding the deep roots of our own potential evil, about recognizing that the shadow is an inescapable part of our humanity, and about consciously transforming that dark energy into a constructive force, into an engine of a constructive force. Creativity, authenticity, and personal growth. When an individual dares to look their shadow in the face, to dialogue with it without fear or moral judgment, to consciously integrate its dark aspects into their conscious psyche, they can release an immense creative energy, until then repressed and wasted. The integrated shadow becomes a source of power, intuition, passion, authenticity, which enriches and complexifies the personality, making it more human, more complete, more resilient, and paradoxically, more luminous. The process of individuation, the integration of the shadow, is not an easy path, nor a quick one, nor one without risks. It implies a descent into the hells of one's own unconscious, a courageous confrontation with our inner demons, a radical acceptance of our own imperfection and moral ambiguity. But it is precisely in this descent into darkness, in this dark night of the soul, where the possibility of a psychic rebirth, of a profound transformation of the personality, of a success that transcends the superficial categories of social recognition or worldly power to reach a much deeper and more authentic dimension resides. The fullness of being, the integration of all facets of one's own humanity, the conquest of one's own individuality in its totality, with its lights and shadows, with its virtues and vices, with its greatness and fragility. In popular culture, in literature, cinema, theater, the archetypes of the shadow manifest in multiple forms, through complex, ambiguous, morally gray characters, who fascinate and disturb us in equal measure. Characters such as the Joker in The Dark Knight, the tormented Darth Vader in Star Wars, the ambiguous Lady Macbeth in Shakespearean tragedy, or the seductive and dangerous Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs, embody, in their own way, different facets of the collective shadow, archetypes of human darkness that we project outwards, that we fear, and that, at the same time, irresistibly attract us. Their actions, often morally condemnable, their dark motivations, their ability to transgress norms and challenge the established order, ultimately reflect the crude honesty of what happens when the collective shadow manifests without filters, without the mediation of rational consciousness and social repression. Jung invites us, therefore, not to shun our own darkness, not to blindly project it onto others, but to explore it bravely, to understand it in depth, and to integrate it consciously into our path of individuation, transforming what weakens and torments us into an inexhaustible source of strength, creativity, and authenticity. Because, ultimately, true success in life, according to the Jungian vision, does not reside in the denial of the shadow, but in its courageous and conscious integration. Arthur Schopenhauer. Transcendental pessimism and paradoxical liberation through conscious suffering, delving even deeper into the exploration of darkness as an essential dimension of human experience. We now enter the singular and deeply pessimistic philosophical universe of Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th-century German thinker whose somber, seemingly disheartening vision offers us, paradoxically, a revealing perspective on the nature of suffering, the blind will that drives existence, and a blind will that drives existence. The possibility, perhaps elusive and arduous, of achieving a form of inner liberation through full awareness of reality, even in its crudest and most painful aspect. Schopenhauer, a solitary philosopher, often misunderstood in his time, whose main work, The World as Will and Representation, is considered one of the pinnacles of Western pessimistic thought, invites us to contemplate human existence from a radically different perspective from the optimistic and progressive currents dominant in his time. His philosophy, marked by a profound disillusionment with the promises of reason, progress, and earthly happiness, offers us, however, an unexpected path towards a form of inner success, a liberation that is not measured in terms of external achievements or social recognition, but in the conquest of a deep serenity and a radical acceptance of reality, including its most painful and inevitable dimension. For Schopenhauer, the world we perceive, the world of representation, is nothing more than an illusion, a superficial phenomenon that hides a deeper and more fundamental reality. The will. This will, with a capital W, is not the conscious and rational will that we experience in our daily lives. It is not the capacity to choose and decide that distinguishes us as human beings. No, Schopenhauer's will is a metaphysical, irrational, blind, relentless force that drives all existence. From the smallest atom to the most immense galaxy, from the most primary instinct to the highest aspiration. It is a force without conscious purpose, without predefined direction, that simply wants to live, that manifests itself in the constant struggle for survival, reproduction, and the expansion of life in all its forms. For Schopenhauer, and here lies the heart of his transcendental pessimism, life is intrinsically marked by suffering. The will constantly drives us to desire, to yearn, to seek satisfaction, fulfillment, happiness. But this satisfaction, this fulfillment, this happiness, are always fleeting, illusory, even deceptive. Once we believe we have achieved a desire, once we manage to satisfy a need, another desire, another need, immediately arises, in an endless cycle of longing and frustration, of seeking and disappointment. Pleasure, for Schopenhauer, is nothing more than the momentary cessation of pain, a brief truce in the constant struggle for existence, an ephemeral oasis in the desert of suffering. Life, in its essence, is unsatisfied desire, perpetual struggle, inevitable pain, and death, far from being a solution, is nothing more than the momentary cessation of individuality, but not the end of the will, which continues to manifest itself in new forms, in new existences, in an eternal cycle of suffering and rebirth. In this deeply pessimistic philosophical context, how to interpret the phenomenon of immoral success, how to understand why some individuals transgressing conventional moral norms seem to reach peaks of power and recognition that contradict the traditional view of success as a reward for virtue and moral rectitude. Schopenhauer suggests to us that those who pursue success in the conventional sense, those who tirelessly strive in the pursuit of the satisfaction of their selfish desires, in the accumulation of material wealth, in the conquest of worldly power, or in the search for social recognition, are in reality deeply deceived, trapped in the wheel of suffering, perpetually fueling that insatiable will that dominates them, that manipulates them like puppets in the absurd theater of existence. Their success, from Schopenhauer's perspective, is nothing more than an ephemeral illusion, a trap that keeps them tied to the cycle of desire and frustration, of longing and disappointment, of momentary pleasure and persistent pain. Instead, Schopenhauer points out a different path to us, an escape route from this endless cycle of suffering, the deep understanding of the essentially painful nature of existence, the courageous acceptance of this implacable reality, the voluntary renunciation of the selfish affirmation of the will, and the search for a form of inner liberation through compassion, aesthetic contemplation, and ultimately the negation of the will to live. By recognizing that suffering and frustration are inherent and inevitable parts of our existence, we can begin to see them not as insurmountable obstacles, nor as evils that we must avoid at all costs, but as intrinsic challenges to the human condition, as opportunities to deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, as catalysts that impel us to seek new forms of personal overcoming, not in the sense of conquering power or accumulating wealth, but in the conquest of inner serenity, of spiritual peace, of radical acceptance of reality as it is. This Schopenhauerian liberation does not necessarily imply a life of conventional moral virtue, understood as obedience to pre-established social or religious norms. In fact, Schopenhauer, in his philosophical pessimism, deeply questions the effectiveness of traditional morality in alleviating human suffering, in transforming the selfish nature of the will, in leading to true inner liberation. His philosophy invites us to transcend superficial morality, to go beyond the simplistic categories of good and evil, and to seek a deeper understanding of the nature of the will, of desire, of suffering, and of the possible escape routes from this painful cycle of existence. At times, what is perceived as failure or evil from a conventional moral perspective, what is judged as transgression of established norms, may be, in reality, the reflection of an existence in constant confrontation with reality, an existence that refuses to conform to the comfort of illusions, that seeks a form of liberation beyond the empty promises of the world, that finds in the courageous acceptance of suffering and in compassion towards all living beings a paradoxical path towards a form of inner success, of spiritual serenity, of liberation from the yoke of the blind and implacable will. Schopenhauer, in short, reminds us that true success, if there is any in this vale of tears that is human existence, does not lie in the vain pursuit of illusory happiness, but in the courageous and conscious acceptance of reality, in all its crudeness, in all its complexity, in all its inevitable, painful dimension. Albert Camus. Existential absurdity and rebellion as affirmation of individual freedom, from the radical and transcendental pessimism of Schopenhauer, which invites us to seek liberation in the negation of the will and the acceptance of suffering. We now move towards the committed existentialism and vital rebellion of Albert Camus, a 20th-century French philosopher and writer who, although also recognizing the fundamental absurdity of existence, offers us a more active, more humanist perspective, more focused on action and on the affirmation of individual freedom as a response to a universe that is apparently indifferent to human destiny. Camus, an intellectual committed to his time, a fighter against injustices and oppressions, a passionate defender of human dignity, shares with Schopenhauer the premise that the universe is indifferent to our aspirations, to our yearnings for meaning, to our search for happiness and transcendence. Life for Camus has no predetermined meaning. There is no rational cosmic order that guides or protects us. There is no higher instance that grants us a pre-established vital purpose. We find ourselves thrown into existence, launched into the world, as Heidegger would say, without an instruction manual, without an infallible moral guide, without a definitive answer to the fundamental questions about the meaning of life. The origin of the universe, or the destiny of the human being. This awareness of the absurd, this perception of the lack of meaning inherent in existence, could lead to nihilistic despair, to vital paralysis, to the renunciation of all action and all hope. However, Camus, with his unyielding vitalism and his faith in the human capacity for rebellion and solidarity, proposes a radically different path to us. Rebellion as an ethical and existential response to the absurd. For Camus, rebellion is not simply violent opposition to the established political power, nor anarchic transgression of social norms. No, Camusian rebellion is a fundamental attitude towards life, an affirmation of our freedom, our dignity, and our humanity in the face of the indifferent silence of the universe. To rebel in Camus's vision means to recognize with lucidity and courage the lack of intrinsic meaning of the universe, the absence of a rational cosmic order or a pre-established transcendent purpose, but to refuse to passively accept this absurdity, to refuse to succumb to despair or paralyzing nihilism. To rebel is, on the contrary, to insist on the search for meaning, ethical values, vital purpose, in a world that, in itself, does not offer them, in a universe that remains silent in the face of our deepest questions. It is in this constant, passionate, sometimes desperate struggle against the absurd. In this incessant affirmation of our individual freedom and our human solidarity, where we find, according to Camus, the possibility of creating our own meaning, of shaping our own existence, of building a more just, more human, more fraternal world, despite the indifferent silence of the cosmos. In this existentialist context, the figure of the villain is radically transformed. It ceases to be simply a transgressor of moral or social norms to become a powerful symbol of existential rebellion, an individual who refuses to accept easy answers, imposed truths, established dogmas, who radically questions the order of the world, who opposes oppression, injustice, and the absurdity of the human condition. The Camusian rebel, embodied in certain literary or historical villains, does not seek social approval, nor moral reward, nor public recognition. His motivation is much deeper, much more intimate. The imperious need to affirm his own freedom, to live authentically according to his own values, to keep alive the flame of human dignity in a world that constantly tries to reduce him to conformity. Submission, hopelessness. In his desperate search for meaning in an absurd universe, the existentialist villain chooses to challenge established norms, to transgress the limits of the acceptable, not out of intrinsic evil, nor out of a selfish desire for power, but as a way to vindicate his individuality, to protest against the absurdity of existence, and to create his own path, his own values, his own meaning, even if this path is solitary, risky, and inevitably full of uncertainties and challenges. Camus's existentialist perspective resonates deeply with those who feel alienated, misunderstood, marginalized by a society that seems to offer simplistic and false answers to the most complex questions of existence. In those who seek meaning beyond social conventions, beyond the empty promises of traditional morality, and who find in transgression, in ethical and existential rebellion, a way to express their freedom, their authenticity, and their deep thirst for meaning in an apparently absurd world. Sigmund Freud. The deep unconscious, repressed drives, and liberating authenticity finally, to conclude our journey through the shadows of success and transgressed morality, we turn to the pioneering figure of Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist who revolutionized the understanding of the human mind with the creation of psychoanalysis. Freud offers us an invaluable lens, a powerful conceptual tool to understand the hidden motivations, unconscious impulses, deep psychic conflicts that shape our behavior, our decisions, our relationships with others and with ourselves, including, of course, those actions that society judges as immoral, evil, or transgressive of established norms. Freud, by exploring the depths of the unconscious, by unraveling the mechanisms of psychic repression, by revealing the complex dynamics between the ID, ego, and superego, provides us with a fundamental key to understand the human fascination with a fundamental key to understand villains and immoral success, to demystify simplistic moralizing narratives, and to recognize that transgression, in certain cases, can be interpreted not only as an act of rebellion or selfishness, but also as a distorted, but often eloquent, manifestation of a deep search for authenticity, for liberation from the shackles of repression, and for integration of the dark dimensions of our being. Freud, with his revolutionary genius, showed us that the human mind is not a unitary, transparent, and rational entity, as traditional Western philosophy had pretended, but a complex psychic apparatus divided into conflicting instances, governed into conflicting instances, largely by unconscious forces that escape the control of reason and conscious will. He revealed the existence of a vast unconscious territory, a psychic domain submerged in the depths of our mind, which operates outside our rational consciousness and which, nevertheless, exerts a powerful, often determining influence on our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and our interpersonal relationships. In this deep unconscious reside our most primary instinctive drives, our repressed desires, our forgotten traumas, our unresolved psychic conflicts, our unconfessable fantasies, all those mental contents that rational consciousness and the moral superego consider unacceptable, dangerous, shameful, unacceptable, and that therefore are relegated to the shadows of the unconscious, where they continue to exert their hidden and often disturbing influence. According to Freud, much of what we do, what we think, what we feel, is governed by these desires, impulses, and conflicts that operate outside the reach of our consciousness. This revolutionary idea leads us to understand that in many cases, the actions that society judges as evil, immoral, or transgressive are actually the complex and often distorted result of an internal struggle between the different instances of our psyche, the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID, as already mentioned, represents the drive and unconscious pole of our mind, the reservoir of our most primary instincts, governed by the pleasure principle, which seeks the immediate satisfaction of its desires, without taking into account the restrictions of reality or moral norms. The superego, on the other hand, embodies the moral conscience, the psychic instance that internalizes the rules, values, and prohibitions of society, that judges us, blames us, and demands adaptation to established norms. And an ego, finally, is the mediating instance, the conscious and rational part of our mind, which is responsible for constantly negotiating between the demands of the ID, the restrictions of the external world, and the demands of the superego, seeking a precarious and dynamic balance between our instinctive desires, our rational needs, and our moral obligations. In this complex game of psychic forces, the villain can be seen, from a Freudian perspective, as the personification of those repressed drives, those dark and socially unacceptable desires that we all harbor in our unconscious. Transgression, in this sense, can be interpreted not only as a conscious act of rebellion, but also, and perhaps fundamentally, as an unconscious release, often distorted, maladapted, and destructive, of these repressed impulses that seek to manifest themselves, that struggle to come to light, even if in a disordered and harmful way. Society, through the moral superego, imposes on us a series of norms, prohibitions, and taboos that seek to control, channel, and repress our instinctive drives, especially those of a sexual and aggressive nature, considered dangerous for social coexistence and the established order. However, the excessive, rigid, and inflexible repression of these unconscious impulses, far from eliminating them, can generate deep internal conflicts, neuroses, psychic discomfort, and, paradoxically, behaviors that society itself judges as negative, inadequate, or even evil. Freud, in his clinical wisdom, suggests to us that the path towards greater psychological integrity, towards a deeper authenticity, and towards a fuller and more harmonious life, necessarily passes through the conscious recognition, the courageous exploration, and the gradual integration of these unconscious impulses, of these repressed drives that inhabit the shadows of our mind. It is not, I insist, about giving free rein to our darkest desires indiscriminately, about justifying destructive behaviors, or about embracing immorality as an ideal of life. It is, rather, about learning to recognize and understand the origin, nature, and dynamics of these unconscious impulses, about accepting their existence as an inescapable part of our humanity, and about finding constructive, socially adapted, and about finding ethically responsible ways to channel their energy, to transform their destructive potential into creative forces, into vital impulses that enhance our personal growth, our capacity to love, to create, to work, and to relate to others in a more authentic and full way. Freud teaches us, in short, that the path towards greater authenticity and psychic fullness necessarily passes through deep self-knowledge, through the courageous and compassionate acceptance of all facets of our being, even those that we would prefer to keep hidden, even those that society judges as dark, immoral, or unacceptable. Because it is precisely in this painful but liberating reconciliation with our shadowy aspects, in this conscious integration of our repressed drives, where we can find a form of radical authenticity, of inner strength, and of personal success that transcends established conventions, a success that is not measured in terms of social approval or external recognition, but in the conquest of greater psychic harmony, of a fuller, more authentic, and ultimately more meaningful life. Expanded conclusion: the unfinished symphony of light and shadow, a legacy for personal transformation by uniting the complex, rich, and often contradictory perspectives of Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Machiavelli, Jung, Schopenhauer, Camus, and Freud. Surprising, fascinating, and profoundly human image is revealed before our eyes about the phenomenon of immoral success, about the hidden reasons why those individuals who deviate from conventional morality, who transgress established norms, who dare to explore the forbidden territories of existence, often leave an indelible mark on history, in culture, in the collective consciousness of humanity. It is essential to reiterate it again and again, about justifying reprehensible acts, about glorifying evil, or about promoting immorality as an ideal of life. It is rather about understanding with greater depth and nuance the complexity of the human condition, about recognizing that what we often superficially call evil, immorality, or transgression can be in reality the distorted, but often eloquent, manifestation of a deep search for authenticity, for liberation from the shackles of conformity, for rebellion against the limitations imposed by society, power structures, and one's own internal limitations. This intellectual journey through the thought of these giants of philosophy and psychology invites us to radically rethink our preconceived ideas about good and evil, success and failure, virtue and vice, light and shadow. It reminds us that human reality is not black or white, but unfolds in a wide range of grays, nuances, ambiguities, and paradoxes. It teaches us that, at times, those who break the rules, who challenge the norms, who venture into darkness, do not do so simply out of gratuitous rebellion, out of unbridled selfishness, or out of an intrinsic destructive impulse, but because in enshrined their passionate, sometimes desperate struggle against the established, against the conventional, against the preconceived, they are forging their own path, unique, authentic, towards a fuller, more meaningful, and ultimately, more human existence. The examples we find both in classical literature and contemporary culture, from the complex and contradictory characters of Dostoevsky to the morally ambiguous journey of Walter White in Breaking Bad, or the dark humanity of Tony Soprano in The Sopranos, show us that even those who seem to have fallen into darkness, who have transgressed the limits of conventional morality, can offer us valuable lessons, revealing perspectives on human resilience, the capacity for personal transformation, the incessant search for meaning, and the possibility of reinventing oneself, even in the most adverse and challenging contexts. For you who have come this far, who have dedicated your time and attention to exploring these complex and often uncomfortable ideas, these reflections are not just a matter of philosophical speculation or intellectual analysis. They are, above all, practical tools, conceptual keys for your own personal growth, for a deeper understanding of your own existence, and for the search for a more authentic and full life. Perhaps you have felt, at some point in your life, trapped by social expectations, by the rigid norms of a society that seems to reward conformity and punish dissent, that values the appearance of virtue more than genuine authenticity. Perhaps you have experienced firsthand the internal struggle between what you deeply desire to be and what is expected of you from the outside, between your own authentic values and the pressures of conventional morality. The teachings of Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Machiavelli, Jung, Schopenhauer, Camus, and Freud show us that the path to a full life, to a truly meaningful success, does not necessarily pass through avoiding darkness, through denying our own shadow, through repressing our most unconfessable impulses, but through facing it with courage, through learning to recognize it, to understand it, to dialogue with it, and to consciously integrate it into our total personality, transforming it into an unexpected source of creativity, inner strength, radical authenticity, and ultimately, personal liberation. Today, as we conclude this deep reflection on immoral success and the fascination with villains, I invite you to stop for a moment to contemplate your own life, your own history, your own internal struggle, and ask yourself honestly and bravely, what part of yourself have you left in the shadows? What desires, what yearnings, what hidden aspirations, perhaps even unconfessable ones, are waiting to be recognized, to be integrated into your consciousness? What social norms, what rigid moral mandates have prevented you so far from fully exploring your potential, developing your authenticity, and achieving a fuller and more meaningful life? No longer fear the darkness within you. Dare to explore it, to understand it, and to transform it into the light that illuminates your path towards a more authentic and successful existence in the deepest sense of the word. Final invitation. And now, we reach the end of this fascinating journey into the shadows of success. I hope these ideas have resonated with you, that they have inspired you to question your own beliefs, to explore the unexplored corners of your being, and to embrace that complex duality that makes us human. Remember, darkness is not something we should fear or avoid, but an essential part of our humanity, a potential source of transformation and growth. If you have found this video valuable, if you feel the call to continue exploring these profound themes, and to embark on a path of self-knowledge and personal development, I cordially invite you to join our community. Subscribe to this channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss future videos, and share this content with those who may also benefit from these reflections. Together, we can continue exploring the hidden secrets of success, learning from the great minds of history, and above all, discovering how to transform our own darkness into the light that guides our path towards a more authentic and full life. Thank you for joining me on this journey of reflection and discovery. Don't forget to leave your comments, share your own ideas, and above all, continue embarking on this path of self-knowledge and personal improvement. Subscribe and join us on the adventure of becoming better every day. Until next time.